Hello and welcome to this retrospective look back at what has to be one of, if not the, most iconic vintage cartoon series ever to grace our childhood TV screens. I'm Retro Steve UK and this is Tom and Jerry, a cartoon show that's been in production since 1940. That's shortly after the Second World War began, and considering how long it's been around, it's aged amazingly well. If you rewatch these cartoons today, the animation quality, comedy timing and lovable characters still have the ability to make us belly laugh even now with our modern day on-demand TV sensibilities. In this video, we'll be taking a look at the cartoon's history over different eras and how the art and musical styles changed. We'll have a close look at one or two classic episodes, we're considering the cartoon's various controversies, and we'll be sharing some of our own memories with your featured comments. Stay tuned as well for some bonus footage at the end. And remember, if you need to jump around to different parts of the video, you can follow the chapter markers that I've placed along the video timeline. I'd also like to remind the Tom and Jerry fans out there that all of these classic era episodes can still be purchased on DVD and Blu-ray and through online streaming services like Prime Video, HBO and Apple TV, so I recommend having a browse of what's available to relive some classic childhood memories. The first ever episode of Tom and Jerry was made in 1940 by Hanna-Barbera for MGM Studios. Interestingly, it wasn't titled as a Tom and Jerry cartoon, but was a standalone one-off cartoon called Puss Gets the Boot, in which an unnamed mouse is pursued by a cat named Jasper. Jasper ends up making a mess in his attempts to catch the mouse, much to the displeasure of the housekeeper, who threatens to boot him out if he breaks one more thing. The clever mouse realises he can taunt Jasper by threatening to break things, and hilarious hijinks then ensue, ultimately ending up with Jasper breaking pretty much everything, and of course the mouse getting his wish, as Jasper is unceremoniously booted out of the house. This first cartoon set a wonderful template for things to come, and eventually the following year in 1941, the second instalment was released, this time with the characters proudly named as Tom and Jerry, and the rest is history. The initial run of 114 episodes were produced by Hanna-Barbera between 1940 and 1958. The classic Hanna-Barbera artwork in this run is perhaps the most recognisable art style, as these were the episodes that aired most often on our TVs back in the day, mainly due to the fact that there were so many of them. This is the art style that conjures up the most nostalgia for me when I'm rewatching old Tom and Jerry episodes. The visuals were accompanied by a fully orchestral soundtrack, resembling the epic soundtracks of big blockbuster movies of the time. The second run of 13 episodes were produced by Gene Deitch between 1961 and 1962. Gene Deitch's artwork on these is very similar to the first run and does a great job of emulating the Hanna-Barbera style. However, on close inspection you can see the 1960s influence in the line work and colouring, and the style is marginally simpler and a little more polished in its look. Some distinctly 1960s sound effects were also used in this run. Altogether though, with the inclusion of that unmistakable orchestral music, these cartoons still feel unmistakably like classic Tom and Jerry. The third run of 34 episodes were produced by Chuck Jones from 1963 to 67. These episodes also keep the original sound stylings of the orchestral soundtracks, which helps no end with retaining that classic episode feel, and the art style continues the 1960s feel with their bolder lines and stronger, more solid colours. The final run of what I consider to be the classic era marks the return of Hanna-Barbera, with 49 episodes released between 1975 and 1977. These episodes introduced the biggest departure from the original 1940s run, with music that sounds like it was produced by a smaller band and less epic orchestral elements. There was also a lot more verbal dialogue, albeit from incidental characters. The art style, however, makes a return to the original 1940s and 50s run with softer, less solid colours and much more background detail, although the bolder, thicker lines are very 1970s, similar in feel to Hanna-Barbera's 1970s Scooby-Doo cartoons. Episodes that came after the 1970s had begun to enter a modern era of experimental styling and heavily sanitised slapstick, which for many of us strays too far from the original winning formula that we fell in love with as children. For this reason, we're looking mainly at the classic era cartoons in this video. The bare bones of each episode were built on the conflict between Tom the cat and Jerry the mouse. Each episode would then be themed around its title, with the backdrops, scenarios and fights being based on whatever that particular episode's theme was. To give you an example, in the 1941 episode, The Night Before Christmas, Jerry emerges from his mouse hole on Christmas Eve only to find a mousetrap loaded with a Christmas-wrapped block of cheese. Smart old Jerry is wise to this and marches past the trap. He discovers the Christmas tree and all the presents laid out underneath it, and embarks upon a voyage of discovery, admiring the decorations and playing with the toys. Eventually, he discovers a soft toy that seems to be a bit different from the others. Unfortunately, that toy turns out to be Tom the cat, and what follows is a series of Christmas-themed chases, traps and fights, with Tom eventually getting the better of Jerry, trapping him outside in the freezing snow. As Tom settles down to enjoy the warm fireplace, he's struck with a guilty conscience and heads outside to rescue Jerry, who is now a frozen popsicle. After defrosting, he gives Jerry a candy cane as an apology, and in return, Jerry kindly uses it to save Tom from a trap hidden in his bowl of milk. The cartoon ends with a "well I'll be" moment from both Tom and Jerry, as Jerry uses the candy cane to grab the Christmas-wrapped cheese from the beginning of the episode. Turns out, Tom was being kind from the outset, as the trap is actually a joke device designed to simply play jingle bells for Jerry to enjoy. One of the main trademarks of Tom and Jerry as characters is their lack of dialogue. They never properly speak to each other in the episodes, although there are occasional exceptions where you'll hear one or the other of them laughing, screaming, singing, or occasionally surreally speaking a few words for comic effect. These occasions are so infrequent and unusual that when they do happen, it's extra funny, and in itself is another trademark of classic Tom and Jerry episodes that make these characters so lovable.
Aim hip to the jive.
Now, we can't cover classic Tom and Jerry cartoons without talking about the controversial aspects. Firstly, and most obviously, there was a visually violent element to the cat and mouse's on-screen action. Some considered it harmless fun, others considered it potentially damaging to vulnerable childhood minds, and I'm sure you'll have your own opinions on this divisive subject. The other major controversial aspect of the cartoons was the frequent racial stereotyping. In addition to images of Tom and Jerry being portrayed as resembling various racial stereotypes, there was a recurring character in some of the earlier cartoons called Mammy Two Shoes. She was a thick-set black woman who closely resembled the historically racist Mammy archetype. She was removed from the cartoons in 1953 after protests from the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People. This is understandable, however some cartoons were edited to replace her with a slim white woman, which in itself could be interpreted as an attempt to sideline black characters in mainstream media. This tricky debate was covered in one of the Tom and Jerry DVD releases, in which the original animations were restored, with Mammy Two Shoes making a comeback, and an introduction was added featuring Whoopi Goldberg explaining the importance of African American representation regardless of how stereotyped it may be. The historical preservation versus historical revision debate will undoubtedly rage on long after we've left this world, and while there is some objective merit to both sides of these arguments, ultimately it's likely to remain open to debate and will probably always be a matter of personal opinion. Tom and Jerry cartoons were a major part of my childhood TV watching habits. It was one of those cartoons that just felt like it had always been there, and I had no idea at the time that I was watching cartoons that were made over 40 years previously. This has to be testament to how good they were. I was barely laughing at Tom and Jerry's hijinks in my childhood, and watching them back now, I still find them equally as funny. I have to mention, however, the scenes involving the racial stereotyping. At the time, these images were just accepted as the norm, but with a modern, more progressive perspective, they do now come across as awkward and insensitive. There's no longer a place for these types of portrayals, and they would not get screen time in any modern shows. I think it's important, however, to shine a light on how society used to be in order to move forward. It's easy for people to slip back into old habits and repeat history if they're denied the historical knowledge of the damage that can be caused by these types of attitudes. Learning from these images, I feel, is an important part of progressing, and therefore I would advocate for accurate historical preservation for that reason alone, rather than removing any evidence of historical and cultural intolerances. And as for the violence, all I can say is that at every stage of my childhood, I definitely understood the difference between slapstick cartoon action and real-life violence and abuse. I knew these characters were make-believe and never once felt inspired by their actions to behave in a similar way. I am, however, open to discussion if your experience was different from mine, and I'll be happy to hear about your thoughts in the comment section. I asked on social media for your thoughts about Tom and Jerry, and a few of you left comments on the community post section of my YouTube channel page, so here's a selection. Liam Greer appreciates how many episodes there were over many decades, but one of his favourites involved Tom and Jerry flooding the kitchen and breaking the fridge, which then freezes the water, and they use the kitchen floor like a skating rink. He thinks he remembers coloured jellies from the fridge spinning past a light to create theatrical effects on the ice. Bren Probert had a fair bit to say on the subject. They loved the Tom and Jerry cartoons, which were endlessly repeated during the 80s. The artwork was stunning and better than the efforts from other animation studios of the time. Bren is a bit fuzzy on the storylines but remembers the characters and was always rooting for Tom rather than Jerry. They also remember the racially stereotyped Mammy character, but in childhood innocence had no idea it was offensive. As for the violence, as a child Bryn doesn't remember finding the cartoons particularly violent, and thinks a certain amount of violence in children's entertainment is normal, citing the Brothers Grimm tales as an example. And although modern cartoons may be much more gentle, kids are now exposed to much more unpleasant sights thanks to the internet. VixGB thinks Tom and Jerry was brilliant, citing the early Fred Quimby and Hanna-Barbera episodes as the funniest and most beautiful to look at. While they're all gems, her favourite episode is Pecos Pest. This is actually a particularly memorable episode featuring Jerry's fearless guitar-playing Uncle Pecos, who is seemingly indestructible and causes major headaches for Tom, who just can't seem to get the best of him. Opal Guy always loved Tom and Jerry as a kid and now has the DVD box set with all the Fred Quimby produced ones. Fred was a producer from the early Hanna-Barbera run. The DVD box set contains 159 cartoons in total. And finally, Jason Marison, aka @BloodRainUK, posted the biggest comment and remembers Tom and Jerry being on BBC One around tea time. He loved the ones with Spike the dog and particularly loved the episode where Jerry finds a baby elephant and paints it to resemble a giant version of himself to scare Tom. He remembers the big band music and the ways Tom and Jerry used to fantastically distort in shape to resemble the weapons that they'd been injured by. He points out that although there was violence, its insane slapstick nature renders it unreal enough to be reduced to pure comedy. He thinks the racial dynamics were reflective of attitudes in America at the time, and doesn't think it was done to deliberately upset or harm anyone. He finishes by saying that Tom and Jerry is a story of basic rivalry, cat versus mouse, and it works beautifully, and watching sanitized re-edits of the original was never the same. If you have any more Tom and Jerry memories you'd like to share, post them in the comments and we can have a chat there. And if you'd like to appear in a future retrospectives video, follow me on my various social media platforms, where I'll be asking for your comments whenever I'm working on something new. I also have a Buy Me a Coffee tip jar if you'd like to say thanks with a small gesture. You'll find all the links in the video description. We'll finish off the video now with a supercut of classic moments from Tom and Jerry cartoons. But first I'd like to thank everyone who shared their comments, to thank you for liking and subscribing, and of course to thank you all for watching Retrospectives.